Hi, everybody, and welcome back to the third in our series about resilience and well-being. And this one's about tapping into your strengths. So welcome back for those people who attended the first few, and welcome for the first time for those people who are joining for the first time. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we begin. If you click on the resources button below, you will get access to a few things, the slides that I'm presenting today, plus a couple of PDF resources that will be really useful to use after this presentation. There will also be links to the first two presentations that I did, one on building resilience and well-being strategies, and the other one on understanding and managing fear. And even better, you will also get another link there for the fourth and final of the presentations in this series about understanding and managing difficult emotions. So without any further ado, let's kick off and start this one. And what I did want to do, first of all, is to just really recap some of the key things that are going to be important to remember as we move forward in here. Everything I do is always around the science, is always around the brain, and it relates back to the biochemistry that we have within us. So remembering that our brains are wired for two things, really. It's the basic organizing principle of our brains, and one is to minimize danger, and the other one is to maximize reward. Now, we have those two key responses, if you remember, the threat response and the reward response. And these are stimulated when we experience either a positive emotion or a negative emotion. Now, the same is true for when we play to our strengths as opposed to playing to our weaknesses. So when we really hang around in our weaknesses, what we perceive to be a weakness, effectively it sets up the threat response for us, where we see a rise in adrenaline or a rise in cortisol, and we get a lowering of that dopamine, that feel-good neurotransmitter. So basically, not a great place to be. So if we're hanging around playing to our weaknesses, we don't feel so hot, and we could get a little bit stressed. On the other hand, if we're playing to our strengths, well, we get a drop in that cortisol, so we're not as stressed. Our body systems are working well, functioning well together, and we're feeling better as well because we get the dopamine. And that fuels our prefrontal cortex. That fuels our thinking and rational brain. So that's a recap of what we've done previously. So just keep that in mind, the basic organizing principles of the brain and the biochemical reactions that are going on here, because it really is relevant. All right. As I said, everything we do here is really based around the science and the research. And I want to share with you now some of the research that's gone over the last 2 decades into the area of strengths by some fairly reputable, well, very reputable positive psychologists out there. Now, the work done by Dr. Alex Linley out of the UK has really gone a long way to understand what strengths actually are in human beings. And here is a definition that a strength is a pre-existing capacity for a particular way of behaving, thinking, or feeling that is authentic. Now, this is really key, that it's authentic and energizing to the user. It enables optimal functioning and development and performance. Now, it's a bit of a mouthful, and what it means about pre-existing is it was not there, but basically it's there now. Obviously, when we're born, we don't have a lot of strengths. We learn things over time. So pre-existing means just before now, because we can learn new stuff and discover that it is a strength of ours. A really amazing piece of research was done on nearly 20,000 people, and this is what this graph is across on the right-hand side. Now, go with me for a second here as I explain what this was. So what we have on the vertical axis here is a change in levels of performance, increasing or decreasing levels of performance. And what was actually done is this research group was split into two groups, so 10,000 basically in each group. One group had development opportunities identified for them that played on their weaknesses. In other words, here's all the stuff that you are not good at. So let's put a development plan in place to raise you up. You're not very good at it. You don't enjoy it. it's not good for you. So we're going to make sure that you, for 1 year, focus on your weaknesses to try and improve them. Sound familiar? Yeah, it's kind of what normally happens. You know, if you're in your job and doing your performance appraisals, for example, you know, people identify what you're not good at and focus on them to try and improve them. Kind of makes logical sense. But this research has flipped it around a little bit. So one group did that, identified the weaknesses and focused on them. The other group of 10,000 people had their strengths identified and then did more of those. So basically really leaned into those strengths and did development plans that focused on what they were already good at. And you sort of think, well, that's a little bit counterintuitive. How am I ever going to get better at other things if, you know, I'm not even focusing on them? This is the really interesting part. So what they found is that for the group that focused on their weaknesses, they found an overall drop of 26.8% in their performance over the duration of 1 year. And what that means is not only did the things that they were trying to improve on not really get that much better, but overall, across the board, they got worse at other things. Their overall performance went down. However, for the group that focused on their strengths, their overall performance in the course of that year went up by 36.4%. And a really weird thing happened is that their weaknesses actually got better without focusing on them. And if you think about that, what actually happened, if you think about putting yourself into that shoes, if you, for the period of 1 year, you knew that you had to focus on all the stuff that you're not good at, what kind of mental state are you in? How are you likely to show up to do those things? I would say that, you know, if I was not liking it and I was no good at it, it would be like, oh, you know, I would probably show up really de-energized to do that task. And that's exactly what happened. These people ended up being really de-energized, really unmotivated, and so stuff that they were good at normally started to get worse. Whereas these people, by looking forward to their development, by looking forward to what they were going to be doing, they showed up differently. They were more motivated, they were more energized, and they were more likely to then have a go at the things that they were not good at anyway. And that started to get a little bit better. So it's some great research there. It was done by what was then called the Corporate Leadership Council, but it's now the CEB or Gartner. But yeah, great research done on over 20,000 people. So it's really robust stuff. So that's a little bit of research. And what they actually found out of the other end of that is that when people focus on their strengths, some really cool things start to happen. So the individual benefits are that you start to get a lower stress. Remember the cortisol, it's going down. Increased levels of energy, increased levels of human flourishing, so people are actually more optimistic, higher levels of resilience, much more likely to achieve their goals, and also this thing called really positive engagement and flow. I'm not sure if you've heard of flow, but I'm going to take a little dive into that in a moment. And I'm going to pause after I've talked about the flow theory to see if there are any questions that you have at this stage, just as I go through this research phase. So look, there are some great individual benefits that you can see there that have been well researched over the last 2 decades. These individual benefits certainly do translate through to organizational benefits. So with higher levels of engagement of employees come higher levels of profit, higher levels of individual performance, and therefore company performance. Your customers start to be more satisfied, because if your employees are satisfied and engaged, well, then it translates logically through to your customers as well. You know, grumpy people in customer service, you know, and unhappy people in the customer service role do not lead to happy customers. So really good things come out of this playing to strengths at an organizational level. on the back of this reduced stress, you will find that if you are managing a company, then basically you might have lower turnover within your staff, lower absenteeism, and higher staff loyalty. These things start to come into play, and there are some really great studies around companies that focus on strengths and employee engagement, retention, and customer satisfaction. And lastly, the resilience factor for an organisation. So when people are at their optimum levels of functioning, they're playing to their strengths, then they tend to lean towards doing more, going over and above, going beyond their job specification. They'll just go that extra step because they're in the right frame of mind to do it. So this facilitates positive change for the whole organisation. So these little ripple effects, if you like, that start simply by focusing on strengths, boost the individual, and then therefore it boosts the organisation in turn. So some really great stuff coming out there. All right, so I did mention that one of the things that happens here is a concept called flow. Now I'm going to have a look at this, and this is the work of a Hungarian psychologist. And have a look at his name here. Yeah, it's a ripper. It's a good one to pronounce. His name is, we call him Mikey instead of Mihai, but it's Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. And it's the way I remember, by Csikszentmihalyi. That's just the way I remember his name. Okay, so he did this research into flow, which basically says about the optimal level of human functioning. And you can see here on my two axes on this chart is that I have increasing levels of skill required at the bottom and increasing levels of challenge on the vertical axis. So basically what it's saying is that if I've got fairly low skill level and I don't have very much of a challenge, then I might end up being quite apathetic. On the other hand, sort of if I've still got fairly low levels of skill and my manager gives me a task that really pushes me outside of my comfort zone, so a really high challenge level, it could result in anxiety. You know, that's a real negative emotion. So I'm not going to cope with that very well, if you like. If you look over on the other side of the coin here, if my skill level is quite high and my challenge level is quite low, well, then I might be tending to be a little bit bored or quite relaxed about something. But when you get high levels of challenge and high levels of skill, you start to enter this area we call flow. So flow is basically a state that's kind of colloquially known as being in the zone. You know, sporting people get in the zone. They're right in the groove. You know, it's this mental state in which a person performing an activity is fully immersed in what they're doing, and they're fully focused. They're getting enjoyment out of it. They're getting kind of immediate feedback out of it. So in essence, flow is characterized by the complete absorption in the task at hand. And most of the time, people who are in flow report that they lose track of time. So time really comes into it. Suddenly hours have gone past and they haven't even really noticed. So they're so immersed in something that they just lose track of time. That's a sign that you're in flow. Maybe you've been in flow at some point in time. But it's optimal human functioning where challenge level is high and skill level is high. So, and you're really playing to your strengths in this case. So that's some of the research that's gone on through the CLC and also through Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. There's a lot of stuff out there. And if you Googled strengths theory and research, you'll probably find a lot. I'm just going to pause there for a moment and just ask Nicole if any questions perhaps have come in at this point.
No questions at this point in time.
All righty. Thanks, Nicole. All right, I will plow on. All right, so let's have a look at how do you tell when you are playing to your strengths or when somebody around you is actually playing to their strengths. And we call this strength spotting. And there's some telltale signs that will give you a few clues that this is actually happening. It can be described as relaxed yet energized and focused. That determination that is a sign, if you like, of you're playing to your strengths. If you're musical at all, it's sometimes described as shifting from a minor key to a major key. A major key is quite bright and energizing, whereas a minor key is kind of dirgy and sad sounding, a little bit off, if you like. You'll hear in language things like "I love" or "it just fits." The language that a person uses will be more colourful. There'll be more words around that one. They will appear to be really authentic and integrated in what they're doing. They're passionate, they're vital, they're absorbed. They will find things easy to explain. So if they're playing to their strengths, they will have a lot of words and explanations, rich descriptions around what they're trying to do or what they're trying to convey. So that will, if you start to notice these things, this will be a clue that somebody is starting to play to their strengths. And quite often, if they start to use childhood exemplars, like examples of things that they did when they were kids, like I used to play with Lego all the time, and I did all that when I was a kid, and now look, I'm a construction engineer. I don't know, something along those lines. So deep set links to childhood exemplars are usually a sign that there's a strength that's sitting there. We all know that playing to our strengths is really key. Sporting teams, as I said before, do it all the time. Organisations do it all the time. You put your key players in the right positions at the right time, both in sporting and in organisational life. So how do we figure out what our strengths actually are? How do we put our a vocabulary around it? Because quite often we think of a strength as being a task. We think of a strength as being just something we're good at, but there's something that sits underneath it that might mean that because I'm good at this particular task, do you know what? I might be good at something else as well because it's using a similar strength. So we need to develop a vocabulary around these things. And to that end, there are quite a few tools around the place, and I just want to share with you a couple of tools that you could use. One of them is free. It's called the VIA. It's called the VIA. It stands for Values in Action. It's a free organisation. Just Google that one, and you can sit an assessment for free, and it will help you to try and identify what your strengths actually are. There is another company out there called the Strengths Profile, and this is the work of Dr. Alex Linley. I prefer that one. It is a paid one, and I'll tell you why I prefer that one in a moment. But there are other things like there's a Strength Finder. There are a lot of tools out there that play in this space. Check them out for yourself. So let's have a look at one of them. So first of all, the VIA strengths. So they have a language around strengths in these 6 major categories, if you like, around wisdom, so the gaining of knowledge, and it's about strength of creativity, the strength of curiosity, the strength of love of learning, or having a different perspective. And you can see that these are not tasks. These are underlying strengths or emotional states of being that will facilitate great optimal human functioning. So it's not actually a task. I'm not good at saying good at football. Well, that's a task. But what is it that sits below that? Maybe you're good at the strategy that sits below it. Maybe you're good at thinking 4 steps ahead, so you're able to get a broader perspective of the game. And that's the thing that sets you apart. So that's a strength that you're playing to. So this is the VIA, the values in action. So they're around wisdom, courage, humanity, moderation, transcendence, and justice. I'm not going to go into all of these. I'm going to go into a different system, but just wanted to show you that this is the free one that you could do. So you could figure out, where your strengths actually lie. What I do want to look at is the strength profile, because it's a really useful tool when you really understand how it functions. Quite often when we think of what a strength is, we just think of it from one dimension, which is, are you good at it? And that's rightly so. And we've thought of it that way for a long time. Am I good at something? Yes. Oh, great. Well, it's a strength of mine. Well, is it fair to say that I can be good at something but not necessarily enjoy it? Of course. For example, I'm really good at writing macros on Excel spreadsheets to extract data. Great. But do I get up out of bed in the morning and go, woohoo, I'm going to write some macros? No, it doesn't float my boat. I'm good at it, but you know what? It doesn't energize me at all. Likewise, I might be really good at proofreading documents and doing all those sorts of things, but do I enjoy it? Not a chance. But because I'm really good at it, maybe people give me lots of things to proofread all the time. And what happens to my levels of motivation, my levels of enjoyment, start to really fall down. So we need to be a little bit careful with this. So what I'm saying is that performance is only one part of the piece of the puzzle here. So yes, performance is there, but also energy really comes into it. So how does it make me feel? Do I get a positive, energizing feeling out of it, or do I go when I'm playing to that strength? So performance, energy, and the last piece is the use. So how often do I use this strength? Do I use it a lot, or do I avoid using it? So by putting these three things together, performance, energy, and use, I can start to understand a little better around where my strengths might lie by, again, putting a vocabulary to them. And with this tool, the Strengths Profile, there are 5 families of strengths, and they are around the being. That's about how we exist in the world. Communicating, are we good communicators or not? Motivating strengths, do I motivate myself and others? How do I relate to other people? Do I have good relationship kind of strengths? And thinking strengths, so that's the creativity and the decision making and all of those sorts of things. So where do my strengths lie in these families? Now, with these 5 families, there are 60 strengths in all. There's a lot. Certainly not going to go through them all now, but that's part of the resource kit that I have included for you. I've got a white paper on this, and I've also got the whole strengths, the 60 strengths for you. And what might be nice is for you to actually have a look at them. You don't have to sit the tool, but you can look at them and try and see what you relate to the most, what resonates with you the most. So when you actually have a look at these strengths, what this profile does is to categorize it into 4 areas, and we call them realized strengths, unrealized strengths, learned behaviors, and weaknesses. Now I'm going to quickly talk about this. So a realized strength is something that you are good at, it energizes you, and you want to do it a lot. So in other words, that strength has come into realization. So you're leaning on it a lot. And what we want to do is use those things. Absolutely. Try and lean into them. We want to use them, but don't overuse them. The unrealized strength is, you're also really good at it. Yes, it also energizes you, but for whatever reason, you're not doing it enough. Okay, it may well be at the worst possible scenario is that you're in the wrong job. You're good at something, and it's energizing, but you're not doing that kind of work. So you might be left wanting. That's not a great emotional state to be in. The learned behavior in the bottom, the orange there, this is something that you do perform well, but for whatever reason, you find it de-energizing. And so therefore you might sort of put it off a little bit and use it variably. And that's that example that I used before about, maybe proofreading something. I'm good at it, but I don't enjoy it. So we would call that a learned behavior. And then lastly, you've got your weaknesses. And this is stuff that you perceive as you perform poorly. It doesn't float your boat at all, and that's okay. And so therefore you probably avoid it. So it's a weakness in yourself. And the thing that I love about this is that this does not lock you in. You can actually work on things and your strengths might start to shift around, so something that was a weakness could actually turn into a strength down the track by doing something about it, but not focusing on it. This is out of the study we looked at before from the CLC. Okay, I'm going to run through for you an example in a moment, but what I want to show you is here are the 60 strengths. I know it's really small. I know you probably can't read it here, but it is in the PDF down the bottom, and it will show you what the strength is. It will give you a definition, and it will tell you what family that strength is actually in, where it belongs. So I would encourage you to have a look at this and see what really resonates with you and see if you can pick up any patterns that are coming out here. And the things that do energize you and you do feel like they are strengths, focus on using them more. All right. That's all well and good, Scott. All the research is there and here's the tools, but how do we use them? How do we use this methodology and relate it back to what we've talked about in previous webinars? All right, so here we go. Here's an example, and this one might resonate with some of you as well. Public speaking is probably one of the most feared things that there is. And I think it was Jerry Seinfeld who said that, on a ranking of 1 to 10, what are the things that people fear the most? Well, public speaking hit number 1 and death was about number 3. So in other words, people feared public speaking more than they feared death. So his analogy was that, if you're at a funeral, you would rather be in the box than giving the eulogy. Anyway, so imagine you are doing some public speaking, and imagine, and there is a strength in this framework that I've just gone through called spotlight. Now, spotlight is loving to be in the limelight, loving to be the center of attention, really likes that kind of stuff, is engaged by it and is good at it, okay? So people who tend to be good public speakers, presenters, trainers, teachers, those sorts of things, tend to have the strength of spotlight sitting up here for them, sitting in a realized strength area. Whereas imagine you had spotlight as a weakness, as this person here does. Okay, so they're thrust into this situation where they're going, oh, I've got to give a presentation. And the things that are going through their head at this particular time might be, oh, everyone's looking at me. What if I stuff this up? I'm really nervous. I'm feeling really worried. So all of these kinds. I don't know how it's going to go. What if they give me a bad rating? I really don't want to be here. So all of those negative emotions will start to come out. And if you remember back from webinar 1, we were talking about the emotion of fear, and these are all part of fear, and they might start to come out. And remember that when we are in fear, then we get a rise in adrenaline and cortisol. So I'm going to feel nervous and jittery. I'm also going to get that stress hormone up, so my bodily systems are not going to be working that well. And more to the point, I get a drop in dopamine. We looked at that at the start again. So remember, dopamine is the fuel for my thinking brain. So not only am I stressed, worried, fearful, I want to get out of there, my brain isn't working at its full potential. It's not up to scratch, if you like. So have a think about that. So by focusing on a weakness, we might find ourselves in a situation where we have this intensity of fear. Fear is a negative emotion. Cortisol goes up, dopamine goes down. So your brain is not working. So therefore, we don't perform as well. So we're highly likely to walk away from this thing having not done a good job, which only then reinforces the fact that I'm bad at public speaking, and the cycle continues. Okay? But what if I have to? Look, the easiest thing to do here is don't do public speaking. Fine. But if you have to do public speaking because it's part of your job and it's part of your role as a manager, say, for example, well, how are you going to emerge from this in a much better state? Well, the answer is by focusing on strengths that do energize you. So let's have a look at a scenario that flips this around. So public speaking again. Imagine up here, or sitting up in the energizing quadrants, and there's one called explainer, there's another one called mission. So these are strengths that I love just explaining things to people. I just love breaking problems down into smaller bits and just going and explaining it. Or, I'm really passionate about the cause. I'm really passionate about why I'm doing what I'm doing. So where does it fit into the big mission, if you like? Maybe it's about the environment. Your mission about something. So maybe that's what I'm passionate about. So what if, instead of turning up to this presentation and thinking, oh, everyone's looking at me, I'm really crap at presentations, blah, 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 all those negative emotions, what if you showed up differently? What if you showed up and went, do you know what? I'm just going to explain this to people. I am going to talk about the environment because I'm passionate about it. I don't care if I go and and I stumble. That's not why I'm here. I'm all about getting my passion about the environment across, or I'm going to explain in minute detail all of these things. I think you would find and all agree that that's a better way to turn up, to stand behind that lectern, focusing on the things that are energizing to you, not the things that are de-energizing to you. Now, if we did that, then my brain starts to focus on those things and starts to focus on explain a mission. I start to become a little bit more confident. Maybe I've got a bit more certainty that's sitting in there as well. Maybe I might have a sense of pride because I am starting to adhere to my mission. And I'm starting to get a little bit more energized because this is the stuff that I love. So all I'm doing is really flipping my mindset. I'm flipping my mindset to a more positive emotion than a negative emotion. And by doing this, I start to dampen down my threat response. And by doing this, that means my cortisol levels are starting to drop. And because I'm not in a threat response, because I'm more likely to be in a reward response, my dopamine levels go up, which means my brain is functioning better. I'm able to think on the spot better. I'm able to be more creative. I may be even able to inject a little bit of humor in there. I'm able to do better. So I'm much more likely to walk away from this scenario having done a bit better than I would have done had I showed up differently with a negative mindset. I may never, ever be the best public speaker in the world, but you know what? By playing to my strengths, I've made the best out of a situation that I perceived was not going to be that great to start with. So playing to your strengths is a really great way of really lifting human performance. Now, the more I do this, the better things get. Remember, we did the broaden and build theory last time, Barbara Fredrickson's work. So the more I set this up as a positive habit, the better it gets. And you know what? I might get really good at public speaking. And then I might have a mindset that opens me up to do other things that potentially scare me. And suddenly, do you know what? My spotlight might not be a weakness anymore. It might shift. It might actually become a strength. And that's the thing about this whole way of thinking. It's different. Traditionally, if I was bad at public speaking, Scott, go on a public speaking course. That would have been, the traditional mindset of doing it. But and I might have even not turned up to the course. I might have just, gone, listened, and then moved on and not taken any of it in and gone back to exactly what I was doing. But if you can flip it around in your brain, if you can make it a positive experience by focusing on your strengths, then you are much more likely to shift it. And this is exactly what that research at the start was talking about. By focusing on your strengths, your weaknesses get better. It's It seems counterintuitive, I know. Your weaknesses get better by not focusing on them. Weird. I know. Our brain is just a strange thing. But it makes sense when you think about it, because it's how you show up to deal with that. So look, that's all I wanted to get across today. It's a shorter session today than we've had previously. It's starting to link everything together that we've been talking about for the past few weeks. So hopefully I've got your mind thinking differently about strengths, about tapping into them, and how you can use that for your own performance and perhaps the performance of people in your team. And even if you've got kids, it's a great way to get kids motivated to try new things and to have a real growth mindset as opposed to developing a fixed mindset. Right. Well, at that point, I might open the line up for some questions. Oh, sorry, I missed this slide. So basically, we can start to flip things around from a threat response to a reward response simply by focusing on your strengths. So I'm going to open up for questions now, if anybody has them.
Thanks, Scott. Got a question from Ashley. Does flow theory pertain to long-term work environment like a project, or short-term tasks like making a spreadsheet, or even both?
Predominantly flow is a short-term experience. It's not that long. So people who tend to get it are musicians, writers, the sewing, or coders, people who are programming. I've heard a lot of coders get it, where they're just so immersed in what they're doing, because hours can seem to disappear. It's not sustainable. It can't go on for days, for example, or months. It's a discrete window of time, but it's not to say that you can't have flow on Monday and then flow again on Wednesday and flow again elsewhere during the course of a project. But it is task-oriented, a challenge level in a particular task with a particular skill level, and when those conditions are actually right. There's a few other things, you've got to be getting immediate feedback into your brain, like a musician who's playing an instrument, ceases to play the instrument. Sometimes it's described as the instrument's playing them, or they don't even think about playing the instrument. They get engrossed in the story that is being communicated, or the emotion of the piece, those sorts of things. So you hear all those sorts of descriptions when you're in flow, but typically no, it can last a few hours, but not sort of a constant state of being.
Thank you. Manisha's got a question. How do we deal with temporary downturns in dealing with our known strengths?
How do we deal with temporary downturns in your known strengths? Oh, okay. So if something was, you're playing to a strength and suddenly it's become de-energized. Okay, good question. So that might mean that you're overdoing it. Okay, so if you remember when I went back to, I'll show this slide again, this one here, our realized strengths. So the dark green area, and we say use these wisely because you can overuse a strength. You get sick of it. You get tired of it. And after a while, it will fall down and become de-energizing to you. So you have to give it a rest sometimes for it to bubble up. Personally, I've got an example of that. I used to, many years ago, work for Microsoft. And when my friends and family found out I worked for Microsoft, I became everyone's help desk. And where I used to enjoy some coding or some tinkering around with under the bonnet of software, suddenly became everyone's help desk. And I was like, oh, and I didn't even want to touch it anymore after that, So I was good at it, and I still am good at that kind of stuff. But do I want to do it? Do I enjoy it? No. I've moved on to other things, and I overdid it. But you might be able to think of other things where you simply overuse a particular strength and you get de-energized by it. So give it a rest, and it might bubble back up to the top again. it might never. You never know. Hopefully that answers your question.
Sounds good. Darren's got a question. How important is planning on reducing anxiety and thus increasing dopamine and reducing cortisol?
Hugely important, because our brains simply cannot function at its optimum level when we are in a state of a threat response with the cortisol. It's just the way our brains are wired, so that when we are in a threat response like this, when we do have increased levels of cortisol, our brains are actually on high alert. It's looking for danger, and we're in a highly stressed state, ready to do something. It's actually our doing, not our thinking, because dopamine goes down. We don't want to be thinking right now. We want to be doing. Great for survival, not for flourishing. Whereas the reward state is when dopamine is down, I'm relaxed, I'm focused, I've got fuel for my brain, and then my brain is in the optimal position. So if you are in a state of anxiety, which is a negative emotion, your brain is not in the right place to be functioning at its optimal peak level. Okay, so you won't be making clear decisions, you won't be recalling information, you won't be as creative, you won't be as intellectual, if you like, if you are in a constant threat response. So your brain, for optimal human functioning and flow and all of those sorts of things, you need to be hanging around with lots of dopamine, less cortisol in your brain. Yeah, great question. So whatever measures you can do to get more dopamine, and that was our session last week. So if you missed that one, have a look at that one. The whole lot of strategies. So how do you get more dopamine and build your resilience and less anxiety? Yeah, great.
Now, Sean's had a couple of comments and questions I think he's really enjoyed today. He particularly liked your slide number 6. But his question is, what is the energy consumption during flow?
Oh, that's a good question, and I'm not sure I actually know the right answer to that one. So when your prefrontal, like how much is it? It's higher. It's definitely high because your brain is doing some work. So whenever your prefrontal cortex is like a gas guzzler, if you like. If you're really concentrating, if you're engaging in high challenge levels, engaging in high skill levels, you are burning through fuel. You're burning through dopamine. And I'll go to slide 6 because you liked it. So Darren, yeah, your prefrontal cortex burns through fuel. And that's why, in answer to the question before, that's why it can't be sustained for hugely long periods of time, because your brain just runs out of fuel. It needs to rest. So yeah, it is increased brain consumption. Fuel is required. That's not sustainable for a long period of time, unless you've got lots of, and that's why it's really important to have all these resilience strategies. So you've got lots of dopamine, you've got good diet, you've got good sleep, because if you don't have a lot of dopamine to start with, it's going to be hard to reach that state of flow. But if you've got lots of good dopamine and good sort of resilience in place, well, then you're much more likely to get there and stay there for longer. Yeah, cool. Thanks, Darren.
That was Sean, sorry.
Oh, Sean, sorry. Sorry, Sean.
Sean's got another question. In the brain image, what are the little wires that are hanging down from the front? I think it might be your slide 16 or 17.
Little wires down here. Oh gosh, yeah. Look, that's just the graphic that I chose. There's lots of different parts to the brain. We've talked about a very simplistic view of the brain, which is the triune brain theory, which is just limbic system, prefrontal cortex, and the base of the brain, which is the reptilian brain. But there is a lot of interconnected tissue that goes on, and the brain is a complex mass of wiring, if you like. So this, I think, coming down from that part of the brain heads towards the optic nerves. So, when you see the outer parts here, it's your motor cortexes. So, the operation of your arm, for example. So, look, I'm not a neuroscientist, so I can't go into the absolute wiring and structure and function of the brain. We don't know a lot about it, but the meninges sit in here as well. So that's some of the connective tissue. So look, what those little things are in this graphic, I don't know. Sorry, Sean. Ask Dr. Google.
Fair answer. Giles would like to know whether you think that the methods you highlighted, so the strengths profile or the VIA strengths, would be the best first steps to really understand our strengths and weaknesses.
Yeah, absolutely. So, look, if you wanted to give it a go for free to start with, have a look at, the VIA because it's free. And then if you wanted to delve into it a little bit more, go into a different profile. Ultimately, it's a language, and it's really about the methodology, and it's really about changing your mindset. And these tools give you, I guess, the language in order to do that. But, simply by also looking at, I know this is really small here, looking at the strengths dictionary that I've included for you and looking at it going, you know what, that stuff does energize me. I am good at that. And if you can start to focus on that and do more of those kinds of things, then that will be the trigger to flip your mindset around. So any task that you're doing where you might find yourself being a little bit de-energized by, go to this dictionary and go, what is it in here that I could use and focus on instead of the negative side? These things are simply a trigger to flip your mindset to the positive, to get the right chemicals happening in your body so you can perform at your best. Look, I'm not wedded to any of them. They're all really good. Personally, I like the strengths profile, but it is a paid thing. But I'll leave you to decide for yourself. But start with the free one. That's the easy one. Start with this and get familiar with it. Read the white paper. Do some searching on Google as well, and I'm sure you'll come up with lots of research. Actually, there is a really good book that you might be interested. It's called Average to A+. Average to A+. And it's written by Dr. Alex Linley, who is from the Centre of Applied Positive Psychology out of the UK. And he's the person who's really was the founder of the strengths movement. So it's a really interesting book. It talks about strengths in education, with kids, in work, in professional sports. There's all sorts of stuff. So it's a good read. Average to A+, Dr. Alex Linley.
Thank you. Got another question here from Joe, who says he never used to think about his strengths and he was fine. He performed well, and then his weaknesses were introduced to him, and he feels like he hasn't had any strengths again and is lackluster on pretty much everything.
There you go. That's exactly what we're talking about here. So by talking about your weaknesses and trying to improve on your weaknesses, it is a de-energizing thing to do. In other words, you're focusing on that red area. And if you focus on the things that you're perceiving as being you're no good at it and it's de-energizing, you get more de-energized. So thank you for saying that. That's awesome. And the fact that you weren't even aware of your strengths before, you were probably playing to them. So it's about how can you reconnect to those now. Forget about your weaknesses. Forget about them. They will be there. You don't need to spend any time. And as all the research shows us, by focusing on the stuff that you're good at, what energizes you, perceived weaknesses just get better anyway. So look, that's a really important point that you raised. So and unfortunately, it's kind of the way traditional stuff has gone. If I'm bad at something, I must get better. Well, okay, that's fine. That may well be the case, but it's how you go about improving it. What mindset are you in to actually help you get there? This links quite closely to the work of Dr. Carol Dweck, all about growth mindset. She's a developmental psychologist, predominantly works with children. So if you're parents, it's a really great book to read. It's all of her research is all about developing a growth mindset. So acknowledging weakness, you can acknowledge it, but you don't focus on it. You look at it as an opportunity to learn. There's no judgment. You just find ways not to do stuff. But by focusing on other things, by focusing on the positive, you will shift your weaknesses because you're in a much better state of mind to do it. Important comment. So just reinforces the fact that focusing on weakness is the surest way to de-energize children and adults. No one likes to be told that, but it's not. The comment I often get is, well, isn't that just avoiding? Well, no, it's not. There's another method to do it. So there's another way of doing it. By focusing on weakness, you make it worse. Acknowledge it, then focus on something else to help pull it up, if you like, is the best way to go. Yeah, that's what all the research tells us. And you kind of know it makes sense instinctively. Cool. Thank you.
Great comment. Thank you, Joe. Jeff has got a question. Would it be fair to say that the current uncertain times we are in would be creating a somewhat heightened and extended threat response to some people?
Absolutely. Absolutely, it would, without a shadow of a doubt. So if we look at some of the emotions that we've got here, these are the emotions of fear, if you like. So they create uncertainty. So feeling a bit on edge, feeling just a bit nervous, feeling worried, all of these things here are intensities of the primary emotion of fear. And we talked about that in webinar 1. The antidote to fear is certainty. So for people who are experiencing uncertainty and fear at the moment, if they can get a little bit of certainty in some parts of their life, in any part of their life, it will help. Certainty about anything, certainty about establishing an exercise routine. So every morning I know that I'm going to get up, I'm going to take the dog for a walk, go for a run and do a couple of push-ups. Every morning I do that. So it's a routine. Or every morning I eat the same breakfast. Or, having routine in your life in times of uncertainty is really good. It will absolutely help and start to shift things. You'll develop a healthier, happier mindset. If you have uncertainty everywhere, I don't even know what I'm going to have for breakfast because you haven't been organised enough to stock the cupboard, and you go, oh God, what is it? There's nothing in the fridge. It just keeps adding to the levels of anxiety. So in times of uncertainty and in times of fear, get organised, get certain about something, get a routine about something, and your life will start to be a little bit better. Your emotional state will start to be a little bit better, and then you're more likely to start to shift that as well. So that's a number one tip. Do whatever you can to get degrees of certainty. And that is, as we said last time, focus on the things that you can control, not the things that you can't. Okay, so this focus on your strengths, don't focus on your weaknesses. This is key for great psychological health. So yeah, great point. Thank you.
I don't think I've ever said the words uncertain or unprecedented as many times in my life as I have in the last 8 weeks.
Well, that's one thing you can be certain about, the amount of times you've said unprecedented.
This is true. Monica would like to know, and I think this is a great question, how do you know if you've accurately assessed your own strengths versus the ones you wish you had or that you want people to think you have?
Yeah. And sometimes it might be a little hard to swallow. Sometimes, it's like, yeah, and these tools are really quite good at digging out by asking you some really good questions. Go into it with an open and an honest and an authentic way. And just think about if you come back with something that you don't like in your results of any kind of assessment you do, it's just information. It's just data, and go, all right, well, first of all, for example, if Spotlight did come out as a weakness for you, well, the first question I would ask is, so what? I would ask, what's the risk and what's the impact? Think about that for two questions. If Spotlight for me was an absolute weakness, what's the risk for me and what's the impact on my life? Now, if I don't do any public speaking, and if I'm never in the spotlight and I'm not required to do it, fine, great. Don't do anything about it, because make a big badge and go, I'm really bad at spotlight. Who cares? However, if there is a risk and if there is an impact, then I've got to do something about it. So if we can look at it objectively like that, then I think you can be in a much better position to change it. And what other people, you mentioned about other people's perception of your strengths and weaknesses. Sometimes that's really good information to have, because they see things that you don't as well. But ultimately, when you are undergoing this, and if you identify things that might be weaknesses, just ask yourself, what's the risk? What's the impact? And if there's none, don't worry about it. Focus on all the stuff that does you well. Focus on the stuff that does energize you. But the good news is that according, to this research and all of this framework, something that does sit in a weakness, you can change it. Like I went through with this public speaking example, you can change it by not focusing on it. You can change it by focusing on your strengths, and really cool things start to happen. So thanks, Monica. Hopefully that's answered your question.
Quite relevant to what you just said, Scott, is Susanna's asked a question that, what if my weakness is actually really important in my job?
Yeah, absolutely. So, well, in this case here, if the weakness is important in your job, well, then you do need to do something about it. But again, we don't focus on it directly. We lean into other strengths to prop us up. We go, for example, I'm going to lean into mission. I'm going to lean into explainer. I'm going to find another strength. And, there are 60 of them in this framework that you can focus on instead. A couple of key considerations, we'd have to call out if an absolute weakness that is really dragging you down is key to your job, and you work on that to try and move it around, maybe you have to ask yourself the question, am I in the right job? Could be as simple as that, so that's one thing to ask. But if you really love your job for a number of other reasons, well, then you focus on that and you try and shift and improve and get better, in that particular area. It may be that, you have to look at some really simple other practical things to do, like, is there a part of your job that you're finding de-energizing? Is there a part of your job that's just not resonating with you? Can you job craft to get rid of that bit of your job, to give it to somebody else who is, able to do it and they like it? We tend to have these very fixed boundaries of, roles, and maybe we need to be a little bit more flexible if that's possible. Not possible if you're self-employed and you're a one-person band. But have a think about those sorts of things. If it truly is absolutely necessary for your job and it's absolutely getting you down, I would probably take stock of the situation and start to think a little differently about that one, and go, well, what do I need to do? Try and move it from threat to reward as much as you can. Try the techniques by focusing on your strengths first. And I'm sure you'd be surprised at the movement that you actually get. Thanks, Suze. I think that's Suze. I think I recognise you.
Last question is from Rahita. How do you pass on the message about areas of development during a development conversation with a team member? Do you make the focus on strengths? So for example, if a key task in their job is attention to detail, but it isn't their strength, how do you pass this message on?
Yeah, so what I would do is to go, all right, well, here's the task that we need to do. So wouldn't focus on that particular strength if it's a weakness for them, and go, here's the task that we need to get better at. How are we going to attack that? Let's have a look at the things that you really are energized by, and pull out the strengths dictionary and it's like, well, how would you approach this task? You have a really good coaching conversation with somebody to go, well, how would you best approach this particular task in order to be better at it, rather than just go, you've got to have more attention to detail. Well, that's not going to help. You've just got to go, all right, well, let's have a conversation about how we could probably improve that by utilizing maybe being, organized, or I don't know. You would need to have a look at one of the other strengths that they find energizing and help them through it as a way of attacking that. So it's not so much the what, it's about how. How are you going to flip their mindset around from I really don't want to do this to, you know what, I want to give this a go. And that's the key here, is flipping it around in your brain. So that would be how. Thanks, Rahit.
Thanks, Scott. Just a last comment. I believe you dropped out earlier with one of the books you were referencing. I'm not sure if you remember the books you commented on and recommended, whether you might be able to just give those details once again before we wrap up.
Sure. Okay. So the strengths book is Average to A+. That's Average to A+ by Dr. Alex Linley, Linley. And the other one I believe I mentioned was Mindset by Carol Dweck, Dweck. Mindset by Carol Dweck were the two books that I referenced.
Fabulous. Thank you very much. That's all the questions. We're all done for today.
Wow. Thank you very much, everyone. And thank you for all of the great questions. And if you are interested in the fourth and final in this series, just remember, go down to the link below to the resources tab, and you can register there. All the resources are there as well. Hopefully this has been of use to you today and maybe changed your mind a little bit about strengths and weaknesses and given you some food for thought. So look forward to seeing you again in 2 weeks' time for the fourth in our series, where we bring it all together, basically, all of these last three things. Cool. All right. See you later, everyone.